Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Dharma Junkie Podcast. So I've been going through, I don't want to call it a dark night of the soul or the dukkha. I just have been going through some weird stuff in my head lately. And I think it's because I'm just so busy. I stay pretty busy all the time. And I'm on spring break right now, but I don't actually get to take a break because I'm still very busy doing homework. I'm writing for this training I'm in. I'm remodeling a house for someone. And all these things take up a tremendous amount of time. So I really haven't had the time to just slow down and do anything for myself other than my regular meditation practice. But even in my regular meditation practice, some dark shit's been creeping in. And I think that's a very poignant thing to mention because my guest on this episode is the author of The Dark Side of the Dharma, Anna Lutkajtis. Anna is a postgraduate researcher and author from Sydney, Australia, and her research focuses on mysticism, psychedelics, and the relationship between mental health, religion, and spirituality. So I thought that she was a perfect guest for Dharma Junkie, and she was. Imagine that. But this particular book, The Dark Side of the Dharma, explores some of the possible undesirable side effects, also that could be called adverse effects, of meditation and mindfulness. And she investigates why these effects, which are well known in spiritual and religious traditions, have been ignored in contemporary secular contexts such as Western psychology. So buckle up, this is a really good episode. Without further ado, Anna Lutkajtis.
You might catch yourself sliding in and out of a hallucinatory state. Just relax and enjoy it. Just relax and enjoy it.
This is an experiment in mind formation. Information. Forming, controlling, operating your mind and your brain. Using digital techniques to overload, scramble, confuse, unfocus your mind. The natural state of the brain is chaos. Chaos is beautiful.
Anna, welcome to Dharma Junkie. How are you doing today?
I'm well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, I thank you so much for coming on. I read your book, Dark Side of the Dharma, and most of it, as we were just talking about before I started recording, I read most of it. I got 5 chapters in or so, and I'm very much looking forward to the last 2 chapters because everything I've read so far has been very much things that I have not only seen in other people, but experienced in my own life. And it's really, really fascinating. Could you give everybody that might be listening a little bit of background about yourself? And then we'll go ahead and get into the book a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So my background is straight out of school, I did a psychology honors degree. But never actually practiced as a clinical psychologist. I ended up going and working in corporate and a few different creative pursuits. And the thing with psychology that was missing for me was that I was always interested in, I guess, what you would call the transpersonal or the anomalous and the spiritual side of things. So a bit later in life, I ended up getting into the academic study of religion. And I came to that through my own personal meditation practice. So I guess I'll start, it's hard to know where to start, but I'll start in my late 20s, early 30s, I learned to meditate. So I came to the practice looking for stress relief, relaxation. I wanted to sleep less, all of those wonderful benefits that are advertised with secular meditation practice. And when I started meditating, I started to experience some unusual effects. So in the intro to the book, I mention a few of these. So the initial one was headaches, which I thought was really unusual. And I spoke to the teacher about that. And he said, look, don't worry about it. That can be really normal at the beginning of practice and it passes. Just keep practicing. And so I pushed through and the headache subsided. And then I started to get this really interesting effect where I would notice a sphere of light appear in yeah, but I didn't know what it was. And it was this kind of purple sphere of light that would appear in the center of my vision when I'd be practicing. And again, I went back to the teacher and said, I'm seeing this light. It must be something because it's happening all of the time.
Right.
And he said, don't worry about that. Some people see lights, some people hear sounds, and I started to be really dissatisfied with these responses because I was thinking, and I'm a really curious person, and I wanted to know. I'm like, hang on, what am I actually doing? What is this practice? Like, this is something that I'm doing, for a bunch of personal or psychological effects, but I'm having these unusual effects. So I started to do a bit of research online, and came across Dan Ingram and Kenneth Folk. I can't remember if it was through the Dharma Overground or whether it was through, I think it was through a conversation with Kenneth Folk that he suggested that the light that I was seeing was a nimitta. But it sent me down this rabbit hole of research into meditation, and I just thought, oh my gosh, okay, I've definitely started practicing something that, and I'm just scratching the surface of what this is, and this current teacher, for whatever reason, can't really take me any further. So I ended up calling the University of Sydney, and I thought, I'm going to enroll in a continuing education course about Buddhism because I want to learn more about, where this practice comes from.
Right.
And had this conversation with someone who I thought was an administrator at the university, and she said, why are you interested in this topic? And, we started to have this conversation, and it turns out it was my supervisor, Professor Carol Cusack. And she said, I think you should come and do some research on this. And the whole thing was just really by chance, really serendipitous, that I ended up, coming up with this proposal, working with Carol, and and doing my thesis. And for the thesis, I decided that I wanted to focus on an aspect of meditation that I'd been learning about, when I was looking into Dharma Overground, which was meditation adverse effects. So that topic also appealed to me because of my own personal background, so my interest in psychology, and also the fact that I'd been someone who'd struggled with depression my whole life. Okay. And I was really interested in this idea that, that some people were saying that meditation could kind of be a cure for depression, and then other people were saying that it could actually make things worse. And how could you actually disentangle what were practice-related effects from what was psychopathology? I think that's, the huge question that everyone's interested in. Right. So, sorry, it's a bit of a rambling intro, but that's how I came to be really interested in this topic. And then, anyway, I'll stop there. And did you want to jump off from anything I've just said?
Yeah. So it's like I said, in my conversation the one conversation that I was able to have with Dan Ingram, as I said, he mentioned that the adverse effects are pretty commonplace, especially with a dedicated practice. There, you're going to reach a point in the jhana stages where you do start having some of these adverse effects, and that's like the step before reaching equanimity. I don't know if that's been your experience, but I've definitely had some, as we were using the term dark night of the soul experiences. And what was your experience with that?
Okay. Well, my personal experience was that if there was an adverse effect for me, I would say it was, there were two things. The first was that when I was practicing a lot, I felt that I had, that I experienced a type of dissociation. So feeling that things weren't quite real, that my vision would get pixelated, everything felt kind of 2D and flat. And then along with that, there came, I guess what you'd call a philosophical or existential crisis, where you start to, have some of these insights into, well, what, who am I? What is myself made up of? What is the world made up of? And it can be, I don't know, I liken it to seeing something and then not being able to unsee it. And I think when you when you have some of these insights, then it can make mundane life seem really pointless. And you can become, I became a bit of just a bit meditation and spirituality obsessed, and I was only interested in the ultimate questions, and I wasn't interested in it, like the mundane and the world seemed really unimportant for a time. So that was probably my personal experience. But then at the same time, I guess I demarcate my mental health experiences from that. I feel that I have also suffered from a biological depression that is different to to a dark night. But having said that, if you wanted to put an existential spiritual overlay onto everything, then how could you ever really know? I think we try in Western society to to put things into neat categories, but the interesting thing about depression is that it can have this kind of existential flavor, and even though it's quite pathological, some of these thoughts can make a lot of rational, logical sense. So it's a really tricky one. But in terms of the adverse effects that other people experience, I was very inspired by the work of Willoughby Britton, who, have you had Willoughby on the podcast?
I have not.
Okay, so she's amazing, and she really was a pioneer in this area, and she talks about adverse effects as falling into I was listening to a podcast actually with her the other day, where her research at the moment is looking at she's saying, can too much meditation be too much of a good thing? So she talks about the inverted U-curve model, where you might be getting benefits for a while when you're meditating, and then past a certain point, for some people, you might get diminishing returns. And what can happen when you're overtraining the brain is that some people can experience effects of hypoarousal. So that they're the sort of effects that I was experiencing, where like your emotions are dampened down, you're feeling a bit dissociated, or other people can experience hyperarousal, where they're more anxious, they're having PTSD flashbacks. Along with that, people often experience significant changes to their sense of self. So things like their narrative identity, things like motivation, even their sense of agency, so feeling like they're a doer in their body doing things. These are things that can be affected. And then also you've got people who have pre-existing psychopathology, and meditation can sometimes for those people trigger states like mania or psychosis. So that's kind of an overview of some of the more common adverse effects.
Right. I definitely have friends who have experienced extreme nihilism after extended practice.
It's so interesting.
Yeah, that hasn't been the case for me. I'm kind of I fall into the more hyper aroused category than the hypo aroused. But I was actually speaking with a friend of mine earlier about that, and he was talking about he's just had this extreme sense of nihilism for quite a while now. And I think having this conversation, I can almost attribute it to the meditation. Now, I'm not sure how long it's exactly lasted for him and if he's still continuing a practice, but I think that it was probably rooted from, because at one point he was sitting for upwards of 3-4 hours a day. And that's quite a bit of practice, unless you're on a retreat somewhere. Generally, people aren't. Normally, your average lay person isn't sitting for 3 or 4 hours a day. So
definitely,
I can attribute it to that. Go ahead.
I was going to say too, I mean, one of the things that I think came out of my research, one of the important points to me was what is the goal of your practice? So when I started meditation, I started with a technique that, I literally went on Google and looked up a local teacher, and there was no discussion of, what are your individual personality characteristics, or what are your goals of practice. It was just that there's this one technique, and it's going to be a blanket application for everyone. It's going to work equally well. Go away and do it. The dose is the same. So I think, you have to think about what were the stated aims of these techniques. And, historically in religions, they were, associated with asceticism and removal from society and pursuit of a spiritual path. So, is this a technique that's going to necessarily now apply to someone who's a lay practitioner, who needs to be engaged in society, who has a job or a partner or a relationship? And so I think one of the important things is to realize that there's just so many different meditation practices, and that not every practice is going to suit every individual. So say for your friend who has dissociation, who has nihilism, maybe a more suitable practice would be something like metta or loving kindness, or, even just going out into nature or getting more connected with the world.
Right. Yeah. Well, when you started, what was your main practice? Was it just breath and body, or?
Yeah. So it was a mantra practice.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then, so then I moved into, like a noting practice, and then into fire kasina, which is my favorite practice. Right. To date.
I generally dwell in breath and body, and a lot of the Brahma Viharas. That's my go-to is the heart practices. Generally, I kind of alternate between good old breath and body, which is, like the basic, but I think that's where we always come back to with meditation, even though that's, if you're starting a practice, generally that's where you start. But I think that's kind of where we always come back to, at least in my case. There's so many different meditation variations that are available to us now. But for me, loving kindness, meditation, compassion meditation, forgiveness meditation, those are the, and like, as I said, breath and body, those are kind of where that's kind of my wheelhouse. Those are what work for me. I haven't really expanded outside of that too much. I have done a lot of death meditation. It's just strange because we go into this practice, whatever your goal is when you go into the practice. I don't think people go into it looking for existential dread, but sometimes that seems to be the case.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't think that most people who are meditating now in modern Western society are even going into it looking for enlightenment necessarily. And, that's one of the issues that I bring up in my research, is that in our society now, the goal of meditation has shifted from this traditional religious goal of enlightenment to one of symptom relief or personal transformation. And it's meditation now is kind of seen as a therapeutic technique and part of psychology.
Right. Yeah, I think that's it. That's its most prevalent use now is symptom relief. I know when I started meditating, it was definitely for relaxation purposes and really just to reduce my reactivity. I was incarcerated when I started meditating, and I was just looking for some sort of something to turn the volume down inside my head because what I was going through was an unbearable experience at the time. So for me, it was more escapism at the time. And the more I got into the practice and the more I really started studying and really getting into, like deep, like Pali-Canon Buddhism, Theravada lineage, the more I was like, okay, well, now my goal is awakening. That's the goal. That's the goal. So for sure, that's where I rest now, is like just that steady path towards awakening. And, as he says in this Satipatthana Sutta, that it's the one-way path towards liberation from suffering. And that's my goal, is the liberation of suffering purely. But as we were saying, along the path, you're going to encounter some probably some suffering through the practice. And, as I said, Daniel Ingram has addressed that. And I think he does a really good job of explaining that. Like I said, he was a guest teacher at a training I was in. As I said, he reported that he knows several people who have, committed suicide, because of that. And but I think that, with the Vipassana meditation, with the deep insight meditation, sometimes we're going to get some answers that we're not really looking for. And and I think it's just going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I agree. I think Daniel's done an incredible job of talking about things from the perspective of the Theravada tradition and the Dukkananas. And then there are other traditions that explore adverse effects in different ways. So you've got, are you familiar with Shinzen Young and his work?
A bit, not as familiar as I would like to be, but a little bit.
So he has this really interesting YouTube video where he talks about, he says that he wouldn't use the term dark night to refer to the Dukkananas, but he uses it to refer to insight gone wrong. So he says, and he makes this, I was amazed when I discovered this video because I thought this is just fascinating. But he draws parallels between the insight into no self and no world and depersonalization and derealization disorder. And he's saying it's almost like DPDR. So dissociation, derealization, depersonalization is enlightenment's evil twin. So it's the same insight, but it has this kind of negative affective overlay. Or your what does he say? It's like the diametric opposite. But so that's another perspective. And then you have the transpersonal psychology paradigm, which talks about spiritual crisis, which is a term that was coined in the 1960s when the Groffs, Stan and Christina Groff, recognized amongst Westerners who were practicing Eastern meditation and other spiritual techniques that they would sometimes go into this state of crisis, so this period of transformation that was incredibly challenging, and it could involve all of these symptoms that looked like psychopathology, but it was actually part of a spiritual path, and with the right support, these people could resolve these symptoms and kind of emerge transformed.
You mentioned in the book that seems to be a pretty fairly widely reported aspect of the path from dedicated spiritual practitioners in any lineage, is that is kind of a mark on the path to awakening. Really, it's almost expected.
Yeah, exactly. So the term Dark Night came from St. John of the Cross, and he wrote a poem about his, long and arduous spiritual journey to union with God. And and I mentioned, various saints who have also had these really, really dark times on the path. So this idea that it's all love and light and bliss is very modern Western interpretation of spirituality, and perhaps not, based in reality.
Right. And I think that alone can be very concerning for Western practitioners when they do have a dedicated practice and they're seeing these benefits, and then out of the blue, these negative discursive kind of emotions and thoughts start coming in. I think a lot of times that can dissuade people from continuing, because there are what we could call adverse effects. But if we look at it in a spiritual sense, these aren't really adverse effects. These are almost desired effects.
Yeah, that's right. And I think we have to delineate between what's an adverse effect that's an expected part of the path, and what's an adverse effect that is due to individual differences. So, in religious traditions, they're really there's this is actually discussed and spelled out. So, adverse effects can just be a normal part of the path, like the Dukkananas. They could be due to individual factors like the traits of the individual. So not every individual is supposed to meditate. The most people who throughout history in religious traditions have not meditated. It's been, and I was amazed at this because I thought all monks meditated. And so it was quite interesting to find out that actually historically only a very small number of people have actually been selected to engage in these, arduous practices. And then there are factors like preparation. So, in the West now, we see meditation as a technique that's used to, give us a bunch of positive psychological and well-being effects. But in religious traditions, you find that we've actually got it backwards. So, yogis and monks are preparing to then sit and meditate. So in the system of yoga, you have kriyas, which are cleansing techniques, and you've got your asana practice, your postural yoga, and all of these things are done to prepare someone to then sit, in a lotus position for long periods and meditate. So it's like health and wellness is actually seen as a prerequisite to meditate, not as a side effect of meditation. And then, of course, there are things that can go wrong along the way. Just, and if you've got an expert teacher, they should be able to identify these things. So people might have an imbalanced practice. So there are conditions like in Zen meditation, it's called meditation sickness. So meditation sickness happens when someone's practice is unbalanced and they might be, practicing too much at the expense of engaging with the scriptures or engaging with, the outside world. So, I guess there are different ways to look at adverse effects, like what's expected, what might be a result of the individual, and what could be a result of how they're actually practicing.
Right. Do you still have a dedicated practice? Do you still meditate?
Not recently, actually. So I got really into postural yoga, and I was doing the Ashtanga practice for a long time. I found that was an incredible practice because it's tying the breath to movement. So I would get into these deep kind of concentrative states, especially when you're just practicing in silence for, 90 minutes. And then for a period, I was also really into fire casino because I was getting really interesting visuals. But then I ended up actually probably around the time when I switched over into psychedelic research, just getting really interested in just being in nature, being in the moment, doing a lot of gardening. So I think like in terms of my own practice, I feel like at the moment, I think I spent so many years turning inward and doing a lot of deep, introspective, solitary practice. And now I'm at a phase where my goal is to be more connected with the world. So, I tend to find that, I get beneficial effects just from spending time in nature or playing with my dog, doing those sorts of things. And that's not to say that I won't ever practice again, but just at this point, this is where I'm at.
Right. Well, it's, to my understanding, at least from the Satipatthana and the way it's been taught to me by my teachers, is that meditation and daily life aren't necessarily two things. It's about full engagement in and concentration, or, outside of Vipassana, obviously, but, for people who don't know what Vipassana is, it's an insight meditation. But for me, it's like everything is a meditation. So, you say you go out in nature, you play with your dog. Like these for me would be meditative practices, as long as I am fully immersed in in what I'm doing. It's still a very much meditative practice. And I think we should make a point to say that when we're talking about meditation and practice, we're specifically speaking about a sitting practice and not what I'm talking about now, because as I feel, they're not really separate things if you're living fully engaged. But there is quite a difference between a dedicated sitting practice and then just living, mindfully.
Completely. And I think that Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any substitute for a dedicated insight practice. And
I would agree.
even just, yeah, and even just in daily life, having those moments where like all of that training helps you to just have that little check-in, like, am I in this or am I observing this? And just helpful techniques, to kind of to remind yourself to wake up when you're caught up in thought patterns and the like. But I think another practice that I've been quite interested in is seeking awe, and I think that's a really nice way for me to be connected to the mystical and the spiritual and the unknown and the mystery of life. So yeah, it's all part of the same process for me, but where I'm at the moment, I'm not doing a lot of sitting, but I think that will change again. There's still a lot with Fire Casino that I haven't explored. And yeah, I know that time will come again.
Can we talk about Fire Casino a little bit?
Yeah, sure. What would you like to know?
I'm not particularly familiar with that meditation, and I'm pretty sure that most of my guests will not be either.
Yep.
So if you could just kind of just let us have it.
Yeah. It's a really interesting practice. It's in Buddhism, it's called Fire Casino. In yogic traditions, it's called Tritaka or candle gazing. And it's basically using a candle flame as a meditation object. So I was given this practice by a yogi who called Bava Ram, who is now, he went on retreat and never emerged. It's a whole other story. I think he's still around and alive, but I don't know, he just decided to stop teaching for whatever reason. So it was a very mysterious way that I came to the practice, because at the time I'd had a Zoom or a Skype with him, and we were talking about my health, and he said, I think you should do this practice. It's called Tritaka. He told me it was Tritaka, the way he described it to me. And it involves lighting a candle, sitting in a dark room, having the candle at eye level and staring at the flame, and using it as an object of concentration. He said, stare at the flame for 2 minutes, close your eyes, and then just have a look at the visual field and write down what you see. And then he said, once you've done a cycle, repeat it again. And so I did this, and back in those days, I was a really sincere and vigilant practitioner. So if someone told me to do that, that's what I would do. And I repeated it. And probably after about half a dozen cycles, I realized, hang on, I'm seeing the same thing. So I would have basically what you would call a retinal afterburn from staring at the candle for 2 minutes. But then this afterburn would form into a nimitta. I'm going to call it a nimitta, but there's, a controversy around the correct term as to what you would call this after image. And then, this image would go through a sequence of changes. So it would change in color. It would get certain rings that would appear around it. And I just thought it was the most incredible thing ever, because every time I did this practice and every time I wrote it down, it was the same sequence of colors and rings. I'm like, what is this? This is amazing.
Yeah, it's cool.
So I got onto so I emailed Baba Ram, and I got a response back saying he'd gone on retreat. And I'm like, oh, that's not very helpful.
Is this the retreat that he never emerged from?
Yeah, this is the retreat for years afterwards.
So no answers.
No answers from Baba Ram ever again. But it was Daniel Ingram to the rescue when I, Googled candle gazing meditation and found out that he had developed this interest in this practice, which he was calling Fire Casino. And he had a whole website dedicated to it. And they were discussing, this phenomenon that I'd discovered, which is that, across people and across repetition of practice, people are reporting the same light sequence. And so he got really quite deeply interested in this practice, and they were doing various retreats, and getting to stages that I never achieved with the practice, just because I never went on retreat and I never spent enough time developing it really. But I think it's a fascinating practice. So Willoughby Britton in her research talks about, or I think her husband actually, Jared Lindahl, has an article on meditation light effects, and they suggest that maybe it's if you're looking at mechanisms, we should be looking towards things like sensory deprivation, and maybe it's just the brain responding to sensory deprivation. But I don't know. I have I just think it's incredibly mysterious and worthy of a lot more study.
That's amazing, and you have definitely inspired me to go and try it as soon as we get done with this interview.
Well, I would say, like, my hot tip is don't read Daniel's website and don't read what other people are saying, because then you'll go in with expectancy effects.
Right,
and I think that the great thing for me was that I had no idea what was going to happen. So I wasn't seeking for it. And one of the key things with this practice is to I guess have the sincerity and commitment to it, but also just try and cultivate that attitude of non-attachment to what you're going to see. And because if you start to cling to it, it can be hard. You've just got to really relax into it. But so do it, play around with it first, and then confirm. Rather than knowing what colors and things to look for.
Right. Have you had any conversations with Daniel?
Oh yeah.
He's what a charismatic guy.
He really is. I wish I had
just a ball of energy, isn't he?
I was about to say, I really wish I had his energy levels. He's just like in a constant positive state of hypomania that's non-pathological, obviously, but he's a very very energetic person, and has always been available for conversations over the years. So that's been he's been an inspiration to my work as well.
Right.
One of the few people who's really gone like deep in practice and who will also talk openly about it.
Right. Yeah, that was I feel blessed to have had the brief interaction that I did have with him, and it was just a couple hours. But just a very interesting guy, just a very interesting and very inspiring. His dedication to the practice is just very inspiring to me.
Yeah.
But so when did you exactly start research for Dark Side of the Dharma?
Oh, I was trying to figure this out the other day, because it just feels like such a lifetime ago, especially with COVID. But it was actually the beginning of 2017 that I started to do the research for the master's degree. And that went for about 2 years. And then I actually got the book deal in, just trying to think back, that would have been the beginning of 2019. So I turned it in, like the manuscript, into a book, like from a thesis to a book, in early 2019. Yeah,
it's a great book. Like I said, I'm only 5 chapters into the 7, but so far I absolutely love it. It's one of the better books on the subject of adverse effects of meditation, because you don't really come across that a lot. You get a lot of information on the positive effects, cognitive effects and stress reduction, but not so much about the negative effects. And so I really appreciated your take on that, because it's just something that we don't see very often.
Thank you. And I really, I've tried to make it, it's quite dense because it comes from academic research. There's a lot of referencing in there. And I think it will really appeal to people who have a solid interest, like a deep interest in practice, more so than people who are just starting mindfulness, because it does assume, some level of practice knowledge. But I'm really glad that you like it. I think it needed to be said. Willoughby was doing all of the research into, the presentation of adverse effects and, how they manifest, the phenomenology, what they look like. Then Daniel's obviously speaking about, his take on it in his book, Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha. And I guess my unique perspective on it was I wanted to know why these effects had been ignored. So if people were having adverse effects, then why was no one talking about it? Why was, especially at the time, I guess if you situate contextually the time of my research, it was a time when wellness was really starting to boom. And so I was just noticing in the popular media everywhere stories about meditation and how it was this kind of like panacea, and it was CEOs were doing it and celebrities were doing it, and it was just this 100% positive perspective. And so at the beginning you start to think, like, well, adverse effects real? And there was a lot of victim blaming at that time too. So some of the people I spoke to, not people who were really educated in these systems and practices, but more people who were kind of at the shallow end of therapeutic applications of meditation, and they would say things like, oh, it's obviously this person's got a pre-existing problem, or they've got a personality disorder, right. Or they were going to have a manic episode anyway, or they were doing it wrong, and there was a lot of blaming the victim and blaming the individual. And I think that since that time, in the past 5 years, we've really moved past that phase, which is really good to see.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned that, your book was written from an academic standpoint. And I think that that's one of the things that I really appreciated about it, because it is so thorough. And you've included the citations in there. And that can be very helpful for someone that's actually trying to learn more about this, rather than just glossing over it and just writing a book just to write a book. Like, it really comes from that place of deep knowledge and research. And that's really what drew me into it. Because when I first saw your book, I was, it obviously piqued my interest. And then I got the book, and I didn't know what to expect at first. And then, like, literally from the first few pages, I was very drawn into it, because I am so committed to just research of, everything Buddhism, And so it really spoke to me on that level. And like I said, I really appreciate what you're doing. I can't wait to see what you do with your PhD work. And
thank you.
And you said it's focused on, is it psychedelics in general, or is it psilocybin specific?
So it's psilocybin specifically. So I guess overall, so I will say, going back, thank you for your kind words regarding the book, and it is really thorough. And I guess, like, I wrote the book that I wish I'd had when I started meditating, and so, like, what is going on? So I think I left no stone unturned in terms of, like what I was reading. Like, it was pretty phenomenal. I look back and I was like, where did you have that motivation? Where did that motivation come from? Because my reference list is, like 300 or 400 books and papers.
Very extensive.
It's very extensive. But I was just so genuinely interested in piecing this all together. Like, how did this technique, that was originally in Buddhism and Hinduism, come to be part of secular Western, therapeutic culture.
Right.
And then in terms of the PhD research, so I felt that after I had written the book, I wanted to put down the adverse effects research. I felt like I had answered the question, that I had come to, to the degree with, which is, why has this been ignored? Why is it not out in the open? And I felt like I'd done that, and that probably where the research will go now is, work like Willoughby's, that's looking at frequency and really starting to delineate different effects, like, really drill down into specific changes to certain aspects of self. And I just think there's so much work that needs to happen there, but that's not really where my attention is focused. So still, the thing that fascinates me in the intersection between psychology and religion is this idea around mysticism and healing. So throughout history, religion has always been, associated with healing. And in particular, the mystical experience has been said to, in some circumstances be healing. And I started to become really interested in what was happening in the psychedelic space, particularly around psilocybin and depression. And I thought, like, this offers a perfect paradigm to study, this topic, because you've got you've got a perfect example of a mystical experience being used as a therapeutic treatment. Like in these trials, people are taking enough psilocybin so that they have this altered experience that has what scientists would describe as mystical features, and then people are experiencing significant relief from their symptoms. So I wanted to dive into that more, and I decided that I really wanted to study the phenomenology of the psilocybin experience. So a lot of what you'll hear about in the mainstream media with psychedelics is talk about ego dissolution and, right. People having an experience where their sense of self goes offline, or it's a oneness or unity experience. And while that can happen, there are also so many other things that happen for people when they take psilocybin. So there's a lot of narrative content in there. So there's a lot of really interesting features and overlap with other anomalous experiences like near-death experiences. So in my particular study, people report meeting with deceased loved ones. Like there's just there's a lot to unpack there. So for my PhD, I ended up connecting with an amazing retreat center called Synthesis, and they're based in the Netherlands. And this is just before COVID. So the timing was really, really lucky in the sense that people could still travel and go to retreats, because they were taking in people from all over the world who were traveling to the Netherlands because psilocybin retreats are legal there. And they had, this database of people who'd taken high doses of psilocybin in a legal context, and the legality of it was really important for me in terms of getting ethics clearance to do this kind of study. Right. So my study looks at 30 people who went through a synthesis retreat and took a high dose of psilocybin containing truffles. And I've done hour-long interviews with them where they've described to me the phenomenology of their experience and what they've experienced. So I wrote a pilot study on 4 of my participants and some of the kind of common themes that were coming through. And now I've interviewed 30 people, and the next year is going to be spent kind of analyzing that data and writing it up.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm neither a scientist nor were my experiences legal at the time, but I have definitely experienced mystical experiences on high doses of psilocybin. And it's nothing I do anymore, having taken the precepts. I don't take any mind altering substances, anything that would cause heedlessness. But in the past, definitely so. And for sure, some mystical experiences on my end. And it's interesting to note that in my experiences in the past, the high level psilocybin experiences were very similar to breakthrough DMT experiences in some aspects, and I can only attribute that to them both being tryptamine hallucinogens.
Yeah, possibly. So psilocybin is very, like, the effects are very dose dependent. So people on lower doses might experience some visuals, like geometric visuals, or like psychedelic lattice type overlays. And then as you start to increase the dose, the altered state becomes stronger. And then I actually recently wrote a paper on psilocybin mushroom churches in the States. So there are a couple of churches in America, and one is run by a man called Dave Hodges, and he has a practice of taking what he calls ultra high dose psilocybin. So while the the high dose ego dissolving dose that was recommended by Terence McKenna is about 5 dried grams. Yeah, he's taking like 10 grams and more, and having experiences that I've never taken DMT, but it sounds like a DMT breakthrough experience from what people describe. So he's going to other realms, he's meeting entities. This sense of reality is completely disappearing.
Yeah, that was in my my experiences were my self-professed psychonaut days. And I believe the highest dosage that I ever reached, I would generally eat 5 grams regularly. At one point I was doing it, a few times a month. And saw profound benefits from it. But I think the highest dose that I ever got to was 14 grams. And I absolutely forgot my name. Could not make sense of anything. And it was a very profound experience. It was definitely what we would term a mystical experience, especially at that, which I've had those at the 5 gram dosage in the past, but this one was different. Like I sat and had a conversation with a friend of mine that lives in Mississippi, and let's just say that he was not there. But
I can't believe you were having a conversation. I can't believe you should have been in bed, laying down somewhere safe.
Oh no, I was in my living room. I was on my couch.
Oh, okay, that's good.
But for sure, for me, he was there. I had a 3-hour conversation with my friend Ace, and he was there for me. He was there for me, and he was there for me in my time of need, because I definitely needed some sort of anchor to reality, even though obviously he was not there at the time. But there's like I said, I've noticed very much similarity in the DMT experience and the high level psilocybin doses. And like I said, the only thing I can attribute that to is the fact that they're both tryptamine based hallucinogens.
Yeah, definitely. And then there are researchers who are looking at near-death experiences, and comparing the phenomenology of those to DMT experiences. And there's a lot of overlap there too. And there just seems to be a lot of overlap in all of these altered experiences and anomalous experiences. So even things like reports of alien abduction, that's another topic that I'm really interested in, kind of as a side topic. I'm just fascinated by the fact that some people report having these experiences and seeing this type of phenomena, and and others don't. And it's it's like, why is this happening for these people? And also it seems to be quite context dependent and time dependent. So you're having a lot of alien abduction experiences in the 80s and 90s, and then I don't know, you just don't hear about them. Maybe they are still occurring at that rate, but it seems like, these experiences kind of come in and go or evolve. And I had a very astute friend say, yes, now the alien abduction experiences are happening within the DMT realm, and, it's kind of shifting into something else. So I think, there's a lot of interesting overlap with a lot of these different psychedelics and different contemplative practices.
There's and I've definitely had what I would categorize as a very near-death like experiences or near-death like experience on DMT, and that's happened several times when I used DMT in the past. One thing and this is something that I've kind of been just researching in my off time, is I've noticed a lot of similarity and correlation between the breakthrough DMT experience and the entities that are experienced and the hallucinations of people who have schizophrenia.
Really?
Yeah. There's in fact, there's a couple people this is going to sound awful, but on TikTok that a friend of mine had kind of come across and was like, check this out. And I looked at it and I was like, these are DMT entities. And they're very similar experiences. So I'm not, I don't know what to make of them.
What's on TikTok? People who have schizophrenia are talking about, they're talking about their phenomenology.
Right. They're talking about their experience with schizophrenia. And there's a lot of crossover with the DMT experience, not necessarily in going to, for, a lack of a better term, other dimensions or places that are, discussed with the DMT experience, but the entities that are there are very similar. I mean, starkly similar. And so it prompted me to start doing research into that. And that's something I've been looking into, when I do have time or I think about it.
And out of interest, what sort of entities are they seeing?
There's jesters, a lot of jesters, and like the Baphomet type entity has come up for a lot of people with schizophrenia and obviously with the DMT experience. So it's just weird, the correlation that's there. And I don't know quite what to make of that. Like I said, I'm still doing research. Maybe I'll write a paper on that.
Yeah, but, that's really interesting, because I hadn't heard of that before. I mean, I haven't looked super deeply into schizophrenia, but I thought it was more auditory hallucinations that were the common hallucinations.
No, and generally, not to interrupt, but generally these experiences are accompanied with auditory hallucinations.
Yeah. And the voices it's a negative experience, or
it's definitely been portrayed as a negative experience. It's some of the entities. Now, some of the ones that these people that have schizophrenia are seeing aren't quite as negative, but I believe he even had a name for the jester-like entity, and I think he called it Bertram. And there was a very specific sound that he's like, this is what I hear when I see Bertram, and he kind of replicated the sound, and it was terrifying, if we're being honest.
It's horrible. I know it's fascinating, but it's also, you just think of the suffering that people must go through. I used to have a lot of night terrors, actually, in my 20s, which is the closest thing I've had to an endogenous hallucination, where I would wake up in the middle of the night, and I'd be in this half asleep, half awake state, and I would see spiders on the walls, or rats on the floor, or lizards. And then later, when I was doing quite a bit of kasina practice and quite a lot of intense yoga practice, I would have these weird kind of, I guess you'd call them hypnagogic. Is that the one where you're dropping off to sleep? Yeah, hypnagogic hallucinations, where I'd be falling asleep, and then I'd wake up, but I wouldn't really be awake, but I'd feel like I was being pulled into this vortex of light, or a tunnel or something. And they had this really eerie kind of paranormal feel to them. And I think I've done a little bit of research into sleep paralysis and those sorts of conditions, and there is this this kind of eerie supernatural aspect to those sorts of events. Thankfully, I don't have those anymore, but it was it definitely I don't know. I was saying to a friend the other day, I've had so many unusual experiences, and I think I have to be grateful for them, because they've given me a really good map and cartography of this area, so I can relate to people's experiences. That's probably been even with the depression, it's there's not a lot that's beneficial about depression, but one of the things I think is that I view it as an altered state, and it's a different reality tunnel, and and then when you're out of it, it's a constant practice to kind of be able to be in those types of states and still maintain that sense of an observer, and not get so caught up in the suffering, and know that the state is eventually going to end. So I think it does prepare you in a way for or it trains you to to have that sort of insight.
Right. Yeah. I think depression is definitely an altered state of perception, So it's, I think consciousness is just such a strange thing.
It really is. And I think that's why I have to balance, why my practice at the moment is really a lot of nature-based outdoor practice, because doing this type of research, it can send you down a lot of strange rabbit holes, and you need to maintain. Sometimes you need to step away from it. But then if I step away from it for too long, I start to, I'm like, oh, I need something weird. I need I need to listen to a UFO podcast or something. I need to have that. Need re-enchantment.
Well, hey, but at least we get fantastic books out of the experience, right?
yeah, exactly.
Like
Well,
if you're gonna have adverse effects, at least do something with them.
I know. Yeah, and yeah, it's true. And I think as I said, that was the book that I wish I had access to. And even just so at the beginning of the book, you would have read this chapter if you've read the first few chapters, but just giving a really concise breakdown of the different traditions and what meditation is and what were the stated goals. Just these are things that I wish I had have had when I started meditating. Someone who could just tell me, hey, mindfulness comes from Vipassana, which comes from Theravada Buddhism, and this is the Buddhist system, and these are all the different schools.
Right. Yeah. I love the way you have that laid out. I think you touched on Hinduism and Buddhism, and then I believe you went from there into a more Westernized practice. But yeah, it's all really adapted from with the whole mindfulness movement. It's really I don't think most people that meditate really have no idea where the practice actually stems from. And I think you've done an excellent job of mapping that out in the book and really giving it in a detailed way.
Thank you. Yeah, I would agree. I think most people, particularly if you're coming to meditation through an app, or through a course, most people wouldn't have any idea of that history because a lot of it has purposefully been excluded, because we live in a society where, therapy and the workplace and schools are secular, and it would be controversial to introduce techniques that are religious. And so I guess there's been this idea that meditation, even though it is at the heart of a lot of these, not a lot, all of these Eastern traditions, it's also viewed as being detachable. So it's viewed as being this technique that can be extracted from these traditions and secularized and then applied in different situations.
Right. And like I said, that was my experience of getting into not Buddhism, but meditation. It was very secular. It was, I found a book, like I said, while I was incarcerated, and it was like, here's some basic practices, mindfulness of breath. And it had some yoga asanas in it. And that was my experience getting into it. But then as, time went on, it really evolved into my research into Buddhism and my suffering. I can identify with that. And then and here I am now. I'm an American convert Theravada Buddhist. So
So what was the book that first got you into it?
It was We're All Doing Time by Bo Lozoff. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Who's Bo Lozoff?
He was a friend of Ram Dass. And,
okay.
Him and Ram Dass and Stephen Levine were all kind of friends. But it was just a book I found on a shelf one day, and I was like, this seems like it'll help me. And it was, like I said, I was incarcerated, and it was like, treat your time while you're here like an ashram. And I was like, I can get into that. Yeah. And then so I did, and here we are. And it's been 8 years.
Yeah. And there's just no end to to what you can learn in this space. There are just so many traditions. It's so in some ways it's overwhelming, but I think if it's a lifelong passion, you'll definitely never get bored.
Yeah, and I certainly don't. Especially having wonderful conversations like this.
Oh, thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I really do appreciate it, because I think you've got some really great information in the book, and I can't recommend it enough to everybody that is either interested in meditation, has a meditation practice, is aspiring to have a meditation practice. Like, hey, there's a lot of benefits, but also be aware,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the aim of the book. It's not a it's not a criticism of meditation or any of the traditions or teachers. And I remember someone saying at the beginning of my research that people who spoke about adverse effects were just trying to get famous. And and I never even set out to write a book. I just set out to answer a question. I was like, I don't want to be famous. I don't want to be, talking about these issues publicly. But it just ended up, I saw it was amazing that people saw value in it. And I'm glad it's out there. But oh my gosh, I've lost my train of thought. What were we saying? Just about
I was just letting Go ahead.
Yeah, just setting out to do it. But anyway, I'm glad it's out there, and I'm glad it's of value.
And I am glad it's out there too. Like I said, thank you again.
Thanks, Justin. Thank you.
Thanks again to Anna for being on the show. If you would like to get in touch with her, she can be found at AnnaLutkajtis.com. That's AnnaLutkajtis.com. And if you're interested in her book, it can be found anywhere the books are sold. As always, if you enjoyed this show, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. This has been Dharma Junkie. I'm Justin. Namaste.